Welcome aboard the Bedtime Express, your nightly journey into peaceful sleep and enchanting dreams. I'm your gentle conductor on this evening's journey to the land of dreams. Tonight, we embark on a magical 3-hour voyage to ancient Greece, where we'll follow the tale of Theseus and the Labyrinth. This is not the violent myth you may remember, but a gentle retelling of bravery, friendship, and the silver thread of wisdom that guides us through life's most complex mazes. You'll meet Prince Theseus, whose courage comes from compassion rather than conquest. You'll discover Princess Ariadne, whose gift of the starlight thread makes redemption possible. And you'll witness the transformation of the fearsome Minotaur into something far more beautiful, a symbol of healing and hope. Before you fall asleep, please take a moment to like this video, leave a gentle comment about your dreams, and subscribe to Bedtime Express for more soothing journeys. Your support helps us continue crafting these restful escapes for weary souls. Now, dear listener, find your most comfortable position. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let your worries drift away like morning mist. Allow my voice to be your guide as we follow the silver thread through ancient labyrinths toward the peaceful shores of sleep. Our story begins in Athens, where the Mediterranean waves whisper secrets to a young prince who dreams of adventure. All aboard the Bedtime Express. Let the journey begin now. Theseus and the Labyrinth, the thread of courage. In the time when gods walked closer to the earth, and heroes were born from the union of mortal hearts and divine dreams, there lived a young prince named Theseus. His story begins not with the clash of swords or the roar of monsters, but with the gentle lapping of waves against the marble steps of his palace in Athens. The Mediterranean Sea stretched endlessly before him, its surface catching the golden light of dawn like scattered coins upon blue silk. Theseus would often stand at these steps in the early morning hours, when the world was still soft with sleep and possibility. The salt air filled his lungs with dreams of distant shores, and his heart with a restlessness that spoke of destinies yet unfulfilled. He was a young man of 22 summers, tall and strong, with eyes the color of storm clouds and hair that caught the sunlight like burnished bronze. But it was not his physical strength that would define him, rather the quiet courage that grew in his heart like a seed waiting for the right season to bloom. His father, King Azure of Athens, was a man burdened by promises made in darker times. The king's face, weathered by years of rule and worry, bore the weight of a terrible agreement struck long ago with King Minos of Crete. Every 7 years, like the turning of some cosmic wheel of sorrow, Athens was required to send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete. These tributes, the flower of Athenian youth, would be fed to the Minotaur, a creature half man, half bull, imprisoned in an impossible maze beneath the palace of Knossos. The labyrinth itself was said to be the masterwork of Daedalus, the greatest architect and inventor of the age. Its walls twisted and turned in patterns that defied human understanding, creating a prison so complex that even its creator could barely navigate its passages. The corridors stretched for miles underground, lit by flickering torches that cast dancing shadows on walls carved with ancient symbols. Some said the maze was alive, that its passages shifted and changed, ensuring that those who entered would wander forever in darkness before meeting their fate at the center where the Minotaur waited. As Theseus grew from boy to man, he watched the ships arrive every 7th year to claim their human cargo. He saw the tears of parents saying goodbye to children they would never see again, heard the quiet sobs echoing through the harbor as the black-sailed vessels disappeared over the horizon. Each time, the prince felt something stir within him, not anger, though that was present too, but a deep and growing certainty that this cycle of suffering must end. He would stand at his window overlooking the port, watching until the ships became mere specks on the water, and make silent vows that someday, somehow, he would find a way to break the chains that bound his people to this terrible tribute. The third tribute of Theseus's lifetime was approaching, and once again the lots were being drawn. Throughout Athens, families gathered in their homes, holding their young ones close, praying to whatever gods might listen that their children's names would not be chosen. The selection took place in the great amphitheater, where carved marble seats rose in perfect circles around a central stage. The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone as citizens filed in, their faces marked with the particular gravity that accompanies rituals of fate. Theseus stood with his father on the royal balcony, looking down at the proceedings with a heart heavy as stone. Below them, an old priest in white robes reached into 2 great urns, one for the young men, one for the young women. As each name was drawn and called aloud, a family somewhere in the crowd would embrace their child one last time, knowing that in 3 days' time, their beloved would board a ship bound for Crete and never return. The sound of weeping began softly, like rain on leaves, then grew to fill the amphitheater with a symphony of grief that seemed to reach the very heavens. When the 14th and final name was called, Theseus could bear it no longer. He stepped forward to the edge of the balcony, his voice carrying clear and strong across the amphitheater. "Father, I ask to be counted among the tribute." His words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief that spread through the crowd. King Aegeus turned to his son with eyes wide with horror, but Theseus continued, his voice gentle yet unwavering. "Let me take the place of one who has been chosen. Let me go to Crete, not as a victim, but as Athens itself, carrying the hopes and courage of our people." The king gripped his son's arm, his fingers trembling with the force of his emotion. "My boy, you speak of hope, but what hope can there be in the labyrinth? No weapon can pierce the Minotaur's hide, no map can chart the maze's turnings. You would go to certain death, and I would lose not only my son, but the future of our kingdom. But Theseus placed his hand gently over his father's, his touch warm and reassuring as summer sunshine. Father, sometimes the greatest courage is found not in the certainty of victory, but in the willingness to try when all seems lost. I cannot sit in comfort while others suffer for our kingdom's sake. If I am to be a king worthy of our people's love, let me first prove myself worthy of their sacrifice. The debate continued through the afternoon and into the evening, as father and son walked together through the palace gardens. The olive trees rustled softly in the warm breeze, their silver-green leaves whispering secrets to the gathering dusk. Fountains bubbled peacefully among beds of roses and jasmine, their gentle music a counterpoint to the weighty conversation. Finally, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, King Aegeus placed both hands on his son's shoulders and looked deeply into his eyes. If you are truly determined to go, then go with my blessing, he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. But promise me this, if by some miracle you succeed, if you somehow defeat the Minotaur and escape the Labyrinth, change the color of your sail as you return. The ship will bear black sails, as it always has, the color of mourning and loss. But if you live, if you triumph, hoist white sails that I might see them from afar and know that my son comes home victorious. Theseus embraced his father, feeling the weight of the promise settle into his heart like an anchor. I swear it, father. If I live to see Athens again, white sails will herald my return, and with them the freedom of our people from this terrible burden. They stood together in the garden as night fell completely, surrounded by the soft fragrance of flowers and the distant sound of the sea. Neither spoke of their fears, but both felt them the father's dread at losing his beloved son, the son's uncertainty about the path ahead. Yet beneath the fear was something else, a quiet confidence that this choice, however dangerous, was right. The next 2 days passed like a dream, wrapped in preparation and farewells. Theseus visited every corner of Athens that had shaped his childhood, the gymnasium where he had trained with sword and spear, the library where he had learned the stories of heroes and gods, the marketplace where he had walked among his people as a prince who truly cared for their welfare. Everywhere he went, word of his decision had preceded him. Citizens approached with tears in their eyes, touching his hands and blessing him, calling him the bravest of princes. Children brought him flowers and small tokens, a carved wooden horse, a painted stone, a ribbon blessed by their mothers. These gifts he accepted with gravity and gratitude, tucking them carefully into a leather pouch that he wore close to his heart. On the final evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Theseus stood once more at the marble steps overlooking the harbor. The tribute ship waited at anchor, its black sails furled, its hull dark against the luminous water. Tomorrow he would board that vessel with 13 other young Athenians, and together they would sail toward an uncertain fate. But tonight he simply breathed in the salt air and felt the solid stone beneath his feet, storing up memories of home to carry with him into whatever darkness lay ahead. As the stars emerged one by one in the deepening sky, Theseus offered a prayer to Poseidon, god of the sea that would carry him to Crete, and to Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic courage. "Grant me not the strength of monsters," he whispered to the night wind, "but the wisdom to find hope in hopeless places, and the courage to kindle light in the deepest darkness." The waves lapped gently against the steps in response, as if the sea itself were offering its blessing for the journey ahead. And so ended the first chapter of Theseus's great adventure, with a young prince standing at the edge of the known world, ready to sail toward legend. In his heart burned the flame of a purpose greater than himself, not just to save his own life, or even the lives of his fellow tributes, but to transform a story of despair into one of hope. The labyrinth awaited, ancient and terrible in its complexity, but Theseus would not go into its depths as a victim. He would enter as a hero in the making, carrying with him all the love and courage of the city he called home. The morning of departure dawned clear and still, with barely a breath of wind to stir the harbor's glassy surface. The tribute ship, which had seemed almost graceful in the evening light, now loomed dark and ominous against the pale blue sky. Its black sails hung limp as funeral shrouds, and the figurehead at its prow, a stern-faced goddess with empty eyes, seemed to gaze not toward Crete, but into the realm of the dead. Theseus arrived at the dock as the sun crested the eastern hills, carrying only a simple traveler's pack and wearing the plain white tunic of the tribute bound. The other 13 chosen ones were already gathered near the gangplank, their faces bearing the particular pallor that comes with sleepless nights and tearful farewells. Among them stood Theseus, a poet whose verses had brought joy to many Athenian festivals, and Phaedra, a weaver whose tapestries told stories more beautiful than dreams. There was young Lycus, barely 18, who had been apprenticed to a master sculptor, and Androgeus, named for the son of King Minos, whose death had begun this terrible cycle. Each carried their own burden of fear and hope, their own collection of final gifts, and whispered promises from families they might never see again. As Theseus approached the group, a remarkable thing happened. Rather than the despair he had expected to find, he saw something else in their faces. A subtle straightening of shoulders, a lifting of chins. His presence among them seemed to transform the nature of their journey from a death march into something closer to a quest. If a prince was willing to share their fate, then perhaps their fate was not the hopeless thing it had always seemed. Theseus was the first to approach, clasping Theseus's hand with fingers that trembled only slightly. "My lord," he said quietly, "we are honored that you choose to stand with us." "Not lord, not prince, not here," Theseus replied gently, his voice carrying to all 14 of them. "Here we are simply Athenians together, sharing whatever courage we can find among us. We go not as sacrifices, but as representatives of our beloved city. Let us remember that Athens lives in our hearts, and through us, something of Athens will enter even the darkest places." His words were simple, but they carried a warmth that seemed to spread through the group like sunlight breaking through clouds. The captain of the tribute ship was a grizzled Cretan sailor named Naucrates, whose weathered face had been carved by decades of sea wind and salt spray. He had made this journey 7 times before, always returning with an empty ship and a heavier heart. As he watched the 14 Athenians board his vessel, he found himself puzzled by something different in their manner, a quality he couldn't quite name, but which reminded him somehow of his own crew preparing for an adventure rather than condemned prisoners walking to execution. As the ship slipped its moorings and began to move slowly out of the harbor, King Aegeus appeared on the lighthouse tower that guarded the port. His royal robes whipped around him in the morning breeze as he raised his hand in farewell to his son. Theseus stood at the stern rail, watching his father's figure grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, taking with it the last sight of home. But even as Athens faded behind them, the prince felt not despair, but a strange sense of completion, as if this journey toward danger was exactly where he belonged. The voyage to Crete took 3 days, and each day brought new wonders and new revelations. Theseus had expected his fellow tributes to spend the journey in mourning, but instead he found them gradually opening like flowers in sunlight, away from the weight of their family's grief and the certainty of their fate. They began to rediscover who they were beyond their fear. Menestheus composed verses about the dolphins that raced alongside their ship, their sleek bodies cutting through the waves in joyful arcs. Phaedra spent hours watching the play of light on the water, describing patterns that might someday become tapestries if she lived to weave them. On the second evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, young Lycus approached Theseus where he stood at the bow. "My lord, forgive me, Theseus. May I ask you something? Why do you seem so calm? Are you not afraid of what awaits us in the labyrinth?" The prince considered the question seriously, watching the last light of day paint the clouds in brilliant hues. "I am afraid," he answered honestly. "Fear is not something to be ashamed of. It tells us that what we face matters, that it's worth our concern. But I've learned that fear and courage are not opposites. They can live together in the same heart, and sometimes the presence of fear makes courage more precious, more real. But surely you have some plan, some strategy for defeating the Minotaur, Lycus pressed. Theseus smiled, a expression both sad and hopeful. My only plan is to remember who we are and why we're here. The labyrinth was designed to make people lose themselves, to strip away hope and identity until nothing remains but terror. Our strength lies not in weapons or maps, but in holding fast to the truth of who we are, children of Athens, carriers of its wisdom and its love. If we can remember that, even in the darkest passages, then we carry light with us wherever we go. On the third day, the island of Crete appeared on the horizon like a dream made manifest in stone and earth. Its coastline rose from the Azure Sea in dramatic cliffs topped with olive groves and vineyards, while in the distance, the palace of Knossos gleamed white as bone in the afternoon sunday. The harbor of Heraklion bustled with ships from across the known world, Egyptian vessels laden with gold and ivory, Phoenician traders carrying purple dye and cedar wood, Mycenaean war galleys with bronze-tipped rams glinting in the light. Crete was the hub of the ancient world, the place where all paths of trade and culture converged. As their ship approached the dock, Theseus and his companions could see the crowd that had gathered to witness their arrival. 5. News of Prince Theseus's voluntary participation in the tribute had spread even to Crete, carried by the same merchant vessels that linked the islands in a web of commerce and gossip. The Cretan onlookers showed none of the bloodthirsty excitement one might expect from people witnessing the arrival of sacrificial victims. Instead, their faces reflected a complex mixture of curiosity, respect, and something that might almost have been sympathy. Even in Crete, the story of a prince who chose to share his people's fate had the power to stir hearts and awaken admiration. The palace guards who came to escort them from the ship wore the distinctive dress of Minoan warriors, short kilts, bronze arm guards, and helmets crowned with tall plumes. But their manner was more ceremonial than threatening, as if they were escorting honored guests rather than prisoners. The captain of the guard, a man whose bearing suggested nobility beneath his military role, approached Theseus with something approaching reverence. "Prince Theseus of Athens," he said, his accent lending a musical quality to the Greek words. "I am Asterion, captain of the palace guard. King Minos requests the honor of your presence before the ritual begins tomorrow." The palace of Knossos was a wonder beyond anything Theseus had imagined. Its corridors seemed to stretch for miles, decorated with frescoes that depicted scenes of impossible beauty, dolphins leaping through azure waves, court ladies in elaborate gowns watching sacred dances, young men and women vaulting over the horns of charging bulls in displays of grace and courage. The floors were paved with alabaster and obsidian in intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow as one walked across them. Gardens bloomed in courtyards open to the sky, filled with flowers whose fragrances mixed with the scent of incense from hidden shrines. As they walked deeper into the palace complex, Theseus noticed something that filled him with both wonder and unease. The corridors themselves seemed designed to confuse and disorient passages that led to dead ends, staircases that curved back upon themselves, doorways that opened onto rooms with no other exit. This upper palace, beautiful as it was, served as a smaller reflection of the great labyrinth below. It was as if the entire structure were designed to remind visitors that in this place, the ordinary rules of navigation and escape did not apply. Finally, they arrived at the throne room, a vast hall dominated by a chair carved from a single block of porphyry. King Minos sat upon this throne like a statue come to life, his white hair and beard perfectly groomed, his robes the color of deep ocean water. His eyes, when they fell upon Theseus, held depths that seemed to contain centuries of wisdom and sorrow. Beside the throne stood a young woman whose beauty was so striking that it seemed to transform the very air around her. Princess Ariadne, daughter of Minos, whose role in the coming tale would prove more crucial than anyone yet suspected. "Approach, Prince of Athens," Minos commanded, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to absolute obedience. But beneath the regal tone, Theseus detected something else, a weariness that spoke of burdens carried too long, of duties that brought no joy. As Theseus walked forward across the polished floor, he felt the weight of history in this place, the accumulated years of ritual sacrifice that had stained even its beauty with tragedy. "You perplex me, young prince," Minos said when Theseus stood before him. "In all the years that Athens has sent tribute to satisfy the hunger of the Minotaur, no member of the royal family has volunteered to share the fate of common citizens. Tell me, do you come seeking glory? Do you hope to win fame as the prince who challenged the monster? Or is this some elaborate form of suicide dressed up in noble words?" Theseus met the king's gaze steadily, his own voice calm and clear as he replied, "I come, your majesty, because I could no longer bear to live in comfort while others died for my kingdom's sake. I seek neither glory nor death, but an end to the cycle of suffering that has bound our peoples together in sorrow. If that end comes through my death in the labyrinth, then so be it. But if there is any chance, however small, that it might come through life and victory, then I will pursue that chance with all the strength I possess." A long silence followed, during which the only sound was the soft whisper of wind through the palace corridors. King Minos studied Theseus's face as if reading some invisible text written there, while Princess Ariadne watched both men with an intensity that seemed to burn in her dark eyes. Finally, the king spoke again, his voice softer now, touched with something that might have been respect. "You speak noble words, Prince of Athens. Tomorrow you will have the opportunity to test whether your actions can match their nobility. Tonight, you and your companions will be our guests. Eat well, sleep deeply, and prepare your souls for what lies ahead. As guards led the Athenian tributes to their quarters, Theseus caught sight of Princess Ariadne watching him from the shadows of a colonnade. Their eyes met for only a moment, but in that brief contact, something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, or a promise of aid yet to be offered. Her face disappeared into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Theseus to wonder if he had imagined the encounter entirely. The guest quarters provided for the tributes were surprisingly luxurious, with soft beds, fresh water for washing, and a feast laid out on tables of polished marble. But despite the comfortable surroundings, none of the Athenians felt much desire to eat or sleep. They gathered instead in the central courtyard of their quarters, where a fountain played softly among beds of night-blooming jasmine. In this peaceful setting, they spoke quietly of their homes, their families, and their hopes for whatever tomorrow might bring. Menestheus recited verses he had composed during their sea voyage, poems that captured the beauty they had witnessed in the dolphins' play and the sunset's glory. Phaedra described patterns of color and light that she had seen in the palace frescoes, speaking of them as if they were friends she had met and might encounter again. Young Lycus talked of the sculptures he would create if he lived to return to his master's workshop, figures that would capture not just the human form, but the human spirit, the courage and love that made life precious even in the face of death. As the night deepened and one by one the others retired to their chambers, Theseus remained alone beside the fountain. The water's gentle music reminded him of the harbor at Athens, of mornings when he had stood on the palace steps and dreamed of adventures yet to come. Now that adventure was upon him, wearing a darker face than he had ever imagined, but he found within himself a strange peace. Win or lose, live or die, he had chosen to face his fate not as a victim, but as the hero of his own story. Somewhere in the distance, carried on the night wind, came the sound that would haunt his dreams, a low, mournful bellowing that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the palace. The Minotaur crying out in its eternal imprisonment, a sound that spoke of loneliness and rage and something that might almost have been sorrow. Theseus listened until the sound faded, then whispered a prayer to the stars above. Grant me wisdom to see truly, courage to act rightly, and strength to hold fast to hope even in the darkest passages of tomorrow's maze. And so ended the second day of Theseus's journey, with the Prince of Athens standing at the threshold of legend, while somewhere in the shadows of the palace, forces were already stirring that would transform his story from one of heroic death into something far more complex and beautiful, a tale of love, wisdom, and the thread that would guide him safely home. Dawn came softly to the palace of Knossos, painting the frescoed walls in gentle shades of rose and gold. But Princess Ariadne had not slept to see its arrival. She had spent the night walking the corridors of the palace, her mind turning like the wheels of some great mechanism, considering possibilities and weighing choices that would affect not only her own fate, but the fate of the young prince who had sailed from Athens to meet his destiny. Ariadne was 21 years old, with the dark eyes and olive skin of her Minoan heritage, but there was something about her that spoke of deeper currents than mere physical beauty. She had been educated by the greatest teachers of her age, philosophers from Egypt, mathematicians from Babylon, astronomers who could read the language of the stars. More importantly, she had learned from Daedalus himself, the master architect who had designed the labyrinth that lay beneath her father's palace. From him she had absorbed not just knowledge of engineering and mathematics, but a deeper understanding of how patterns worked, how complexity could be unraveled by those who understood its underlying principles. The labyrinth had been completed when Ariadne was still a child, but she had grown up knowing its secrets in the way that other children knew the paths through familiar gardens. Daedalus, lonely in his genius and perhaps guilty about his creation, had taken the young princess as his unofficial student. Together they had walked the upper passages of the maze during its construction, and he had explained to her the logic behind its seemingly random turnings. "Remember, little one," he had told her, "every maze has a heart, and every heart can be reached by those who understand the pattern. The secret is not to fight the maze, but to dance with it, to follow its rhythm until you find yourself where you need to be." But understanding the labyrinth's secrets and having the courage to act upon that understanding were two very different things. For years, Ariadne had watched the tribute ships arrive from Athens, had seen the young men and women led away to face the Minotaur, and had felt her heart break a little more each time. She had tried to speak to her father about ending the practice, but King Minos was trapped by his own sense of justice and duty. His beloved son Androgeus had died in Athens, killed either by jealous athletes or by the very bull that would later father the Minotaur. The tribute was not just punishment, but a balancing of the cosmic scales Athenian youth to pay for the loss of Minoan youth. Yet, seeing Prince Theseus stand before her father's throne had changed something fundamental in Ariadne's understanding of the situation. Here was someone who had chosen to face the labyrinth, not because he was compelled to do so, but because he believed his choice could transform the meaning of the entire ritual. His words about ending the cycle of suffering had resonated in her heart like the pure note of a temple bell, awakening possibilities she had never dared consider. As the morning light grew stronger, Ariadne made her way to the chamber where Daedalus spent his time in exile. The great inventor had fallen from her father's favor after helping Theseus's future wife Pasiphae with her impossible love for the bull, and he now lived in comfortable but closely watched confinement within the palace complex. She found him, as always, at his work table, surrounded by intricate models and half-finished inventions that defied easy categorization. Some looked like flying machines, others like mechanical creatures that might walk and move like living things. But today his hands were still, and his eyes held the distant look of a man wrestling with profound moral questions. "Master Daedalus," Ariadne said softly, not wanting to startle him from his reverie, "I need to speak with you about the labyrinth." The old man looked up at her with eyes that seemed to hold all the weariness of the world. "I wondered when you would come to me about the young prince," he said with a sad smile. "You have that look about you that tells me you're planning something that will probably get us both in serious trouble." "The tribute begins today," Ariadne said, settling herself on a stool beside his work table. 14 young Athenians will enter the labyrinth, and as always, none will emerge. But this time is different, isn't it? This time, one of them chose to be there. Daedalus set down the delicate brass gear he had been examining and gave the princess his full attention. "Choice does make a difference," he agreed carefully, "but it doesn't change the fundamental reality of the maze. It was designed to be inescapable, and in that design, I succeeded all too well." "But you taught me that every maze has a heart," Ariadne pressed, "and that every heart can be reached by those who understand the pattern. You know the way through the labyrinth. You could guide someone to its center and back again." The old man was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently tracing the spirals and angles of a maze design carved into the wooden surface of his table. "I could," he said finally, "but the question is not whether I could, but whether I should. Your father's trust in me has already been broken once. To betray it again would be an act of healing rather than betrayal," Ariadne said quietly. "Master, you've carried the guilt of this labyrinth for years. Every tribute that has died within its walls has added to the weight on your conscience. Here is a chance to transform your greatest creation from an instrument of death into something that might bring peace between our peoples." Daedalus looked at her for a long moment, his weathered face creased with thought. "You speak of peace, child, but what you're suggesting would require not just knowledge of the labyrinth's secrets, but courage beyond anything I've ever asked of myself. To openly defy your father's will, to risk not just exile, but death." He shook his head slowly. "I am old, Ariadne, and tired of the consequences of my cleverness." "Then don't think of it as defiance," she said, reaching across the table to place her hand gently over his. "Think of it as completing a work that was never truly finished. The labyrinth was meant to imprison the Minotaur, yes, but it was also meant to test heroes. What good is a test that no one can pass? What purpose does a maze serve if it only leads to death? Perhaps this Prince Theseus is the reason the maze was truly built not to destroy, but to prove that even the most impossible obstacles can be overcome by courage, wisdom, and the willingness to accept help when it is offered. The old inventor sat in silence for what seemed like hours, though the sun had moved only a few degrees across the sky. Finally, he rose from his chair and walked to a chest in the corner of the room. From it, he drew forth something that gleamed like captured moonlight, a ball of thread so fine it seemed to be spun from silver itself. "This is no ordinary thread," he said, holding it carefully in his weathered hands. "It was spun by the fates themselves from the silk of spiders that feed on starlight. I acquired it years ago for a project I never completed, thinking it too precious to use for any merely mortal purpose. But perhaps its true purpose was always to wait for this moment." Ariadne held her breath as Daedalus placed the silver thread in her hands. It felt alive somehow, warm to the touch and almost weightless, as if it might float away if she relaxed her grip. "The thread will show the way," the old man explained quietly. "Not just the path to the center of the maze, but more importantly, the path back out again. But it will only work for one who enters the labyrinth with pure intention, not seeking glory or revenge, but truly hoping to heal what has been broken." "How will I know if Prince Theseus is such a person?" Ariadne asked. Daedalus smiled, and for a moment his face bore the expression of the young man he had once been, full of wonder and possibility. "Child, you've already known that from the moment you saw him. Why else would you be here, risking everything to help a stranger? The heart recognizes truth even when the mind struggles to accept it." As Ariadne prepared to leave Daedalus's chamber, the old man called after her one last time. "Remember, Princess, the thread will guide him through the maze, but it cannot fight his battles for him. The Minotaur is real and dangerous and filled with years of rage and loneliness. If the prince is to succeed, he will need more than a path to follow. He will need to find within himself the strength to face a monster and see past its monstrosity to the tortured soul beneath." The sun was approaching its zenith when Ariadne finally found the opportunity to approach the quarters where the Athenian tributes were being held. The palace was bustling with preparations for the afternoon's ritual, servants carrying garlands of flowers, priests preparing sacred oils and incense, guards polishing their ceremonial armor until it gleamed like mirrors. In all this activity, a princess moving through the corridors attracted no special attention, especially one who moved with such apparent purpose. She found Theseus alone in the courtyard garden where she had glimpsed him the night before, sitting beside the fountain in quiet contemplation. His companions had withdrawn to their chambers to prepare themselves for what was to come, leaving him to face his thoughts in solitude. The sight of him there, calm and thoughtful despite the certainty of approaching danger, confirmed everything Ariadne's heart had told her about his character. "Prince Theseus," she said softly, stepping from the shadows of the colonnade. He looked up at her approach, and she saw in his eyes neither fear nor false bravado, but a quiet acceptance of whatever fate awaited him. "Princess Ariadne," he replied, rising to his feet with the natural courtesy that marked him as truly noble. "I wondered if our paths would cross again before the labyrinth." "They have crossed for a purpose," she said, moving to sit on the marble bench beside the fountain. "I have something to offer you if you are willing to accept help from an unexpected source." Theseus studied her face, seeing there not the detached cruelty he might have expected from a Minoan princess, but genuine concern and something that looked remarkably like hope. "I would be a fool to refuse aid from someone who clearly wishes me well," he said carefully. "But I must ask, why would you help an enemy of your people?" Ariadne considered her answer carefully, knowing that her next words would determine whether this conversation would lead to salvation or to disaster. "Because you are not an enemy," she said finally. "You are a young man who chose to face death rather than allow others to die in his place. Because the cycle of revenge and tribute has brought nothing but sorrow to both our peoples, and perhaps it's time for that cycle to be broken. And because—" she paused, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "Because something in your manner, in the words you spoke to my father last night, tells me that you might be the one person who could face the Minotaur and see past its monstrosity to the tragedy beneath." From the folds of her robe, she drew forth the silver thread, and Theseus's eyes widened at the sight of it. Even in the bright noon sunlight, it seemed to glow with its own inner radiance, pulsing gently like a captured heartbeat. "This thread will guide you through the labyrinth," Ariadne explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tie one end to the entrance when you go in, and follow where it leads you. It will take you to the center where the Minotaur waits, and more importantly, it will lead you back out again when your task is done." Theseus reached out hesitantly, then stopped with his hand hovering just above the glowing thread. "Princess, do you understand what you're offering? If your father discovers that you've helped me, the consequences for you could be terrible. Why would you take such a risk for a stranger?" Ariadne met his gaze steadily, and in her dark eyes he saw depths of wisdom and compassion that seemed far older than her years. "Because some risks are worth taking," she said simply. "Because I've watched tribute after tribute disappear into the labyrinth, and each time I've felt a part of my own soul die with them. Because my father is a good man trapped by circumstances he cannot escape, and this might be the one chance to free him from that trap. And because—" she hesitated, then continued with quiet courage, "because I believe that when someone is willing to die for others, they deserve the chance to live for them instead." Theseus closed his hand gently around the silver thread, feeling its warmth spread through his fingers and up his arm like liquid starlight. "I accept your gift with gratitude," Princess Ariadne, but I must ask one thing in return if I should succeed. If I should somehow defeat the Minotaur and escape the Labyrinth, will you come with me when I return to Athens? For I fear that your father's anger at being cheated of his revenge might fall most heavily upon you. The question caught Ariadne by surprise, though she realized it should not have. To help Theseus was indeed to choose sides in an ancient conflict, and there could be no neutral ground once her betrayal was discovered. But as she looked into his storm-gray eyes, she found that the prospect of leaving everything she had ever known seemed not terrifying but somehow liberating. "If you live to leave Crete," she said quietly, "then yes, I will come with you, for I think that someone who can see hope in hopeless places might show me wonders I never dreamed of." As if summoned by some cosmic sense of timing, the sound of bronze trumpets echoed across the palace complex, calling all to witness the ritual of the tribute. Theseus tucked the silver thread carefully into his tunic, close to his heart, and stood to face whatever awaited him. Ariadne rose as well, and for a moment they stood facing each other in the peaceful courtyard, two young people who had found in each other the courage to hope for something better than the fate that seemed to await them. "I should return to my companions," Theseus said. "They will need to see strength in me now, not uncertainty." But before he could turn away, Ariadne stepped forward and placed her hand gently against his cheek. "You are already stronger than you know, Prince of Athens. The Labyrinth will test that strength, but it will not break it. Hold fast to who you are, and remember that even in the darkest passages, you do not walk alone." The trumpets sounded again, more urgently now, and Theseus knew he could delay no longer. But as he walked toward the door that would lead him back to his companions and then to the Labyrinth, he carried with him something more precious than any weapon: the knowledge that someone believed in him, someone who would be waiting and hoping for his return. The silver thread lay warm against his heart, a tangible reminder that even in the maze of Daedalus, he would not be entirely alone. And Ariadne, watching him go, whispered a prayer to her patron goddess, Aphrodite. "Let love be stronger than fear, hope stronger than despair, and let the thread that binds two hearts together prove stronger than all the walls that would keep them apart." The fountain continued its gentle song, and the flowers in the courtyard released their fragrance into the afternoon air, as if nature itself were blessing the alliance that had been forged between a Cretan princess and an Athenian prince. Soon the time for preparation would be over, and the ancient ritual would begin. But for the first time in 7 years, that ritual would unfold with new players who brought with them the possibility of transformation. The Labyrinth waited, patient and eternal as it had always been, but now it would face not just another group of sacrificial victims, but a hero armed with courage, guided by wisdom, and connected to the world above by a thread spun from starlight and love. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the great courtyard of Knossos, as the ritual of the tribute began with all the solemn ceremony that 7 years of repetition had made traditional. Priests in white robes burned sweet incense on altars carved with symbols older than memory, while musicians played haunting melodies on lyres and flutes that seemed to carry the weight of ancient sorrow. The nobility of Crete gathered in tiered seating around the courtyard, their faces reflecting not bloodthirsty anticipation but a kind of resigned sadness, as if they too were prisoners of this ritual that none of them had chosen, but all were bound to witness. King Minos sat upon a portable throne placed at the head of the courtyard, his ceremonial robes the color of deep ocean water, his golden scepter catching the light with each subtle movement of his hands. Beside him, Princess Ariadne occupied a smaller chair, her own garments chosen with careful symbolism, a gown of silver that seemed to echo the thread now hidden against Theseus's heart. She sat with perfect composure, but those who knew her well might have noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the arms of her chair just a little too tightly. The 14 Athenian tributes were led into the courtyard by guards whose manner was respectful rather than rough, as if even they understood the solemnity of what was taking place. The young people walked with dignity, their heads held high, supporting each other with quiet words and gentle touches. 5. Theseus walked among them, not as their leader, but as their brother, offering strength where it was needed and drawing strength from their collective courage. As the formal speeches began, King Minos reciting the ancient justifications for the tribute, priests invoking the gods to witness this offering, Theseus found his attention wandering to the labyrinth entrance itself. It was surprisingly modest, a simple stone archway set into what appeared to be a natural hillside, surrounded by olive trees whose silver-green leaves whispered in the afternoon breeze. No guard stood at the entrance, for what would be the point? No one had ever emerged from those depths to require guarding against. The opening itself was dark as midnight, giving no hint of what lay beyond the first few steps. But Theseus could feel something emanating from that darkness, not malevolence exactly, but a sense of vast complexity, of passages and chambers extending far beyond what the eye could see or the mind easily grasp. The labyrinth was not just a prison or a trap, he realized, but a living entity in its own right, a creation so intricate that it had transcended its original purpose to become something approaching art. Daedalus had built better than he knew, creating not just a maze but a meditation on the nature of choice, pathfinding, and the human need to discover meaning in complexity. The ceremonial portion of the afternoon seemed to stretch endlessly, each speech and prayer adding weight to the moment without bringing it any closer to resolution. But finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western hills, King Minos rose from his throne and spoke the words that would begin the tribute's final journey. "Children of Athens," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "The time has come for you to fulfill the compact made between our peoples. Enter the labyrinth with courage, and may the gods receive your spirits with kindness." As the 14 young Athenians began their walk toward the entrance, something unexpected happened. Instead of the silence that had marked previous tributes' final moments, voices began to rise from the assembled crowd, not cheers or jeers, but something closer to a hymn. The Cretan nobles and citizens, moved by some impulse they could not name, began to sing an ancient song of blessing and safe journey. Their voices rose and fell in harmonies that seemed to transform the very air, turning what should have been a march to execution into something approaching a sacred procession. Theseus felt tears sting his eyes as he realized what was happening. These people, who should have been his enemies, were instead honoring him and his companions as heroes worthy of respect. The song they sang was one he recognized from his studies of ancient poetry, a hymn traditionally offered to warriors departing on quests from which they might not return. In choosing to honor the Athenian tributes in this way, the Cretan people were acknowledging something that perhaps even they did not fully understand: that this day's events would transform both their kingdoms, regardless of their outcome. At the entrance to the labyrinth, Theseus paused and turned back to face the assembled crowd. His voice, when he spoke, carried clearly across the courtyard, reaching even those in the farthest seats. "People of Crete," he called out, "we go into darkness, but we carry with us the light of your blessing. Whatever happens in the depths below, know that your kindness has touched our hearts and will be remembered in whatever realm awaits us." He raised his hand in a gesture that was part farewell, part salute, and part prayer. Then, with a deep breath that filled his lungs with the scent of olive trees and ocean breezes, Theseus stepped into the labyrinth. The other 13 tributes followed him, their footsteps echoing softly in the stone passages as the darkness closed around them like a living thing. Behind them, the entrance remained open, a rectangle of fading daylight that grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely as the passage curved away from the outer world. The first thing that struck Theseus about the labyrinth was not its complexity, though that was immediately apparent, but its beauty. The walls were not crude stone but polished marble, carved with intricate patterns that caught and reflected the light from torches set in bronze sconces every few yards. The floor was paved with mosaics, depicting scenes from Cretan mythology: dolphins playing in azure seas, goddesses dancing with serpents, young men and women leaping gracefully over charging bulls. Even the ceiling was a work of art, painted with constellations that seemed to move and shift in the flickering torchlight. "It's beautiful," whispered Phaedra, the weaver, her artist's eye immediately drawn to the sophisticated patterns decorating every surface. "I had expected something dark and terrible, but this is like walking through a palace built for gods. Young Lycus, the sculptor's apprentice, nodded in agreement as his fingers traced the carved reliefs on the nearest wall. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary," he murmured. "Every detail is perfect, every line placed with intention. This isn't just a prison, it's a masterpiece." Theseus smiled at his companion's wonder, but he also felt the weight of responsibility settling more heavily on his shoulders. The beauty of the labyrinth made their situation more poignant, not less dangerous. They were not just lost in a crude trap, but caught within a work of art so complex that even appreciating it could become a form of imprisonment. It would be easy to spend eternity wandering these gorgeous passages, marveling at their construction while slowly starving to death. Drawing the silver thread from his tunic, Theseus tied one end securely to an iron torch bracket near the entrance. The thread seemed to pulse with gentle light as he let it unwind from the ball, creating a luminous path that would mark their passage through whatever turnings lay ahead. "Stay close," he told his companions quietly. "The beauty here is real, but so is the danger. We must not let wonder make us careless." As they began to move deeper into the maze, following the thread's subtle guidance, the passages began to reveal their true complexity. What had seemed like a simple forward path suddenly branched into 3 directions, then 5, then 7, each passage looking identical to the others. Without the thread to guide them, Theseus realized, they would have been hopelessly lost within the first few minutes. The genius of Daedalus's design was not in making the maze actively hostile, but in making every choice seem equally reasonable while being equally wrong. They walked for what felt like hours, though it was impossible to judge time in the unchanging light of the torches. The passages led them up staircases carved from living rock, through chambers filled with columns that supported ceilings lost in shadow, along corridors that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of human vision. Sometimes they heard sounds from other parts of the maze, footsteps that might have been echoes of their own movement, whispers that could have been whined through hidden passages, distant music that might have been imagination. Gradually, Theseus became aware that his companions were beginning to show signs of strain. The initial wonder at the labyrinth's beauty was giving way to a deeper unease as the sheer scale of their surroundings became apparent. Menestheus, the poet, kept muttering verses under his breath, as if trying to anchor himself to familiar words. Several of the younger tributes had begun holding hands, forming a human chain that would prevent anyone from accidentally wandering away from the group. "Theseus," called Androgeus softly, "how much farther do you think we must go? 0, 5. We've been walking for so long, and every passage looks the same as the last." The prince looked down at the silver thread in his hands, noting that nearly half the ball had unwound already. "We're making progress," he assured his friend. "The thread knows where it's leading us. We must trust in that knowledge and in each other. As if responding to his words, the thread began to glow more brightly, its silver light intensifying until it cast clear shadows on the surrounding walls. Ahead of them, the passage opened into a vast circular chamber, its domed ceiling soaring high above their heads. The walls were covered with frescoes, more elaborate than any they had yet seen, scenes of ancient Crete in all its glory, depicting the palace above as it had looked in the days when King Minos was young and the Minotaur was still the human prince Asterius. But it was not the artwork that drew their attention as they entered the chamber. At the very center of the circular space sat a fountain, its water sparkling with the same silver light as the thread. The sound of its gentle flow was the first natural music they had heard since entering the labyrinth, and the sight of fresh water was more welcome than any treasure. But even more significant was what the fountain represented. They had reached the center of the maze, the heart of Daedalus's great creation. "The Minotaur," whispered young Lycus, his voice tight with fear and anticipation. "Where is the Minotaur?" Theseus held up his hand for silence, listening carefully to the sounds around them. Beyond the splash of the fountain and the soft breathing of his companions, he could hear something else, a slow, heavy breathing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The creature was here, somewhere in this chamber, but hidden by shadows or tricks of architecture that made it impossible to locate precisely. "My friends," Theseus said quietly, turning to face his 13 companions, "we have reached the center of the labyrinth. What happens next, I cannot predict, but I want you to know that being here with you, sharing this moment of danger and possibility, has been one of the greatest honors of my life. Whatever courage I possess, I found it by walking alongside yours. Now I ask you to stay here by the fountain while I seek out the Minotaur. The silver thread will guide us all safely home, but first, this ancient wrong must be confronted and, if possible, healed." Menestheus stepped forward, his poet's intuition sensing truths that others might miss. "Prince Theseus," he said formally, "we did not come this far to watch you face danger alone. We are all Athenians here, all equally bound by the honor of our city. If you face the Minotaur, we face it together." The other tributes nodded their agreement, their faces showing not fear but determination. But Theseus shook his head gently. "My dear friends, your courage humbles me, but this is not a battle to be won by numbers. The Minotaur is not just a monster to be slain, but a tragedy to be understood. If there is to be healing here, it must begin with one person willing to see past the surface of things to the wounded soul beneath. Trust me in this, as I trust in your strength to hold fast to hope while I venture into whatever darkness still awaits." As he spoke these words, a sound echoed through the chamber that made them all freeze, a low, mournful bellowing that spoke of years of loneliness and rage. But underneath that sound, if one listened carefully, there was something else, a note of pain so profound that it seemed to come from the very foundations of the world. The Minotaur was calling out, not in challenge or threat, but in the desperate voice of a creature that had been alone for too long to remember what companionship might feel like. Theseus squared his shoulders and began walking toward the sound, the silver thread unspooling behind him like a lifeline to the world of light and hope above. Behind him, his companions gathered around the fountain, their hands joined in a circle of mutual support, their voices raised in soft songs of encouragement and blessing. Ahead of him, somewhere in the shadows of the great chamber, waited the encounter that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of two kingdoms and the possibility of peace between peoples who had been enemies for far too long. The silver thread glowed brighter as he walked deeper into the chamber's depths, as if responding to his courage and determination. Whatever lay ahead, triumph or tragedy, life or death, he would meet it as he had always tried to live, with honor, with compassion, and with the unshakable belief that even the darkest places could be illuminated by the light of human kindness and understanding. The deeper reaches of the central chamber stretched before Theseus like a dream made of shadow and memory. Here, the carefully maintained beauty of the outer passages gave way to something raw, more primal. The walls were still carved, but the images they bore were different scenes of transformation and pain, of human figures caught in the moment of becoming something other than themselves. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above, and the sound of his footsteps echoed strangely, as if the space around him was far larger than it appeared. Following the gentle guidance of the silver thread, Theseus found himself in a circular alcove lit by a shaft of natural light that somehow filtered down from the world above. In this pool of illumination, surrounded by walls covered in ancient murals, he saw the Minotaur for the first time. The creature was not the raging beast he had expected, but something far more complex and heartbreaking, a being caught between two natures, neither fully human nor fully animal, belonging completely to neither world. The Minotaur sat with its back against the far wall, its massive form hunched in what could only be described as despair. Its head was indeed that of a bull, with curved horns and dark eyes that held depths of intelligence and sorrow. But its body was human in shape, if not in size, and its hands large and powerful, though they were moved with unmistakably human gestures as it traced patterns in the dust at its feet. Around the alcove lay scattered bones, evidence of previous tributes, but also flowers' wilted offerings that spoke of a creature that still remembered beauty even in its exile. When the Minotaur became aware of Theseus's presence, it raised its great head slowly, as if expecting to see just another terrified victim fleeing in panic. But instead, it found the prince standing quietly in the entrance to the alcove, showing no fear, no aggressive posture, no weapons drawn for battle. The creature's dark eyes widened in what might have been surprise, and it made a sound that was neither bellow nor roar, but something closer to a question, as if it were asking who this strange visitor might be and why he showed no fear. "Greetings, son of Pasiphae," Theseus said gently, using the name he had learned from the palace stories rather than the hated title of Minotaur. "I am Theseus of Athens, and I have come not to fight you but to speak with you, if you are willing." The creature's reaction to being addressed by its birth name was immediate and profound. It straightened, its great hands pressing against the wall behind it as if trying to rise, and its eyes filled with what could only be tears. For a long moment, the two beings regarded each other across the small space, the human prince and the creature that had once been human, both caught in the web of an ancient tragedy neither had chosen. When the Minotaur finally spoke, its voice was rough from disuse, but unmistakably intelligent, carrying the accent of the Cretan court where it had presumably learned to speak. "You know my name," it said wonderingly. "It has been so long since anyone spoke my name instead of the curse they made of it." Theseus moved slowly into the alcove and seated himself on a carved stone bench, positioning himself not as a challenger, but as a visitor come to call on an old friend. "I know more than your name," he said quietly. "I know that you were once Prince Asterius, son of King Minos and Queen Pasiphae. I know that your transformation was not your choice, but the result of divine intervention in mortal affairs. And I know that you have been alone in this place for more years than anyone should have to bear." The Minotaur Asterius stared at him with an intensity that seemed to burn in the dim light. "Why do you speak kindly to me?" he asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "I am a monster, a creature of nightmare. I have killed those who came before you, not from cruelty, but from loneliness so terrible that even violence felt like contact with another soul. You should fear me, should hate me, as everyone else does." "I should do many things," Theseus replied with a gentle smile. "I should have stayed safely in Athens, should have let others face this fate while I lived in comfort. But I've learned that what we should do and what we choose to do are often very different things. I choose to see you not as the monster others have named you, but as Asterius, a prince who has suffered more than anyone should have to endure." Asterius lowered his great head, and when he looked up again, his eyes held a vulnerability that seemed almost childlike. "Tell me," he said hesitantly, "what news of the world above 05? I have been here so long that I have forgotten the feel of sunlight, the scent of flowers, the sound of human laughter. Sometimes I dream that I am still the young prince I once was, running through the palace gardens with my sister Ariadne, learning poetry from my tutors, watching the ships come and go in the harbor. But then I wake, and this reality returns." "Your sister Ariadne," Theseus said softly, has grown into a woman of extraordinary wisdom and compassion. She remembers you with love, speaks of you not as you are now, but as the brother you were, and, in her heart, still are. It was she who gave me the thread that guided me to this place, not that I might destroy you, but that I might find you, and perhaps offer something that has been missing from your existence for too long. And what is that? Asterius asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Theseus rose from the stone bench and walked slowly toward the creature, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. When he was close enough to touch, he extended his hand not in challenge or fear, but in the simple human gesture of friendship. Understanding, he said quietly, companionship, the knowledge that you are not forgotten, not abandoned, not beyond the reach of human kindness. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Asterius stared at the offered hand. Then, with infinite care, he reached out with one massive finger and gently touched Theseus's palm. The contact was brief, barely a heartbeat, but in that touch, two worlds connected. The monster and the man, the cursed and the blessed, the imprisoned and the free, all found common ground in the simple recognition of shared humanity. I had forgotten, Asterius said, his voice thick with tears, what kindness felt like. In this place, I have known only fear and hatred, loneliness and rage. But you remind me that I was once capable of love, once worthy of it. Why do you show me this mercy, Prince of Athens? What do you hope to gain? Theseus settled back onto the stone bench, but closer now, within easy conversational distance. I hope to gain the end of a tragedy that has consumed too many lives, he said honestly. Your father's grief at losing his son, the son you were, has driven him to demand tribute from my people for years. My people's fear and hatred of the Minotaur, the creature you became, has poisoned any chance of peace between our kingdoms. But what if there were another way? What if, instead of perpetual conflict, we could find healing? Healing? Asterius laughed bitterly, though without malice. Look at me, Prince Theseus. I am a creature of divine curse, neither man nor beast, but something caught between. There is no healing for what I have become, no return to what I was. The gods do not undo their punishments, and mortal medicine cannot cure divine intervention. Perhaps not healing of the body, Theseus agreed. But what about healing of the heart? What about the healing that comes from forgiveness, from understanding, from the knowledge that your story does not have to end in darkness and solitude? 5. You speak of divine punishment, but I wonder what if your transformation was not meant to be the end of your story, but the beginning of a different one. Asterius considered this for a long moment, his great head tilted in thought. What kind of story could begin with such a creature as I have become? He asked finally. Theseus smiled, and in that smile was all the warmth of sunlight and the promise of dawn after the longest night. The story of a being who chose compassion over cruelty, wisdom over rage, love over loneliness. The story of one who used his suffering to understand the suffering of others, who became a bridge between worlds instead of a barrier between them. From somewhere deep in the labyrinth behind them came the sound of singing the voices of Theseus's companions, raised in harmonies that seemed to fill the maze with light and hope. Asterius's head lifted at the sound, his eyes widening with wonder. "Music," he breathed. "I had forgotten that sound as well. They sing without fear, your companions. Even here, in the heart of the labyrinth, they find reason for song. They sing because they have hope," Theseus explained. "Hope that this day will bring change, that the cycle of tragedy can be broken, that even the darkest places can be touched by light. Come with me, Asterius. Let them see you as I see you, not as a monster, but as a being worthy of respect and friendship. Let them carry word back to both our kingdoms that the Minotaur is not what our legends claim, but something far more complex and far more worthy of compassion." But Asterius shook his great head sadly. "I cannot, my friend, for I dare to call you friend now. My appearance alone would terrify them, would confirm every nightmare they have carried in their hearts. Better that I remain here, in this place where I belong, while you return to the world of sunlight and freedom." "You belong wherever there are hearts capable of understanding," Theseus insisted. "And if my companions' hearts are not yet ready for such understanding, then we will prepare them. We will tell them your story, help them see past the surface to the truth beneath. Change begins with one person willing to take the first step, but it grows through the courage of others to follow." As they spoke, the singing from the central chamber grew louder and more joyful, as if the very fact of their peaceful conversation was transforming the atmosphere of the entire labyrinth. The oppressive weight that had hung over the maze for years seemed to be lifting, replaced by something lighter and more hopeful. Even the light filtering down from above seemed brighter, more golden, touched with the warmth of approaching dawn. "There is something else," Theseus said quietly, drawing the silver thread from where it lay coiled beside him. "This thread that guided me to you, it was made not just to find the center of the labyrinth, but to lead anyone who holds it safely back to the world above. It is long enough for both of us, strong enough to bear whatever weight we place upon it. Come with me, Asterius. Come and see the stars again, breathe the ocean air, feel the warmth of sunlight on your face." For a long moment, hope and fear warred in the creature's eyes. The desire to leave this place of exile was clearly powerful, but so was the terror of rejection, of causing panic and horror among those who had never seen him as anything but a monster. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "If I come with you, if I show myself to your companions, what then? What becomes of the tradition, the tribute, the ancient agreements between our peoples. Then we write a new story, Theseus said firmly. A story in which Athenians and Cretans work together to heal old wounds instead of perpetuating them. A story in which a prince and a transformed prince become symbols not of eternal conflict, but of the possibility of redemption and understanding. Your father still mourns the son he lost, but what if he could rejoice in the son he found again? My people still fear the monster in the maze, but what if they could welcome the friend who chose compassion over violence? Asterius was quiet for so long that Theseus began to fear he had pressed too hard, asked for more courage than even a transformed prince could muster. But finally, the great creature stirred, rising slowly to his feet with movements that spoke of dignity rather than threat. "I will try," he said simply. "For the first time in years beyond counting, I will try to hope instead of despair, to trust instead of hiding. 5. But you must promise me something, Prince Theseus. If this fails, if your companions or our peoples cannot accept what I am, you will not let them destroy me in hatred. Let me return to this place, to this solitude that has at least been honest in its loneliness." "I promise," Theseus said solemnly, "but I also promise this: I will not let fear and prejudice triumph over truth and compassion without a fight. You deserve better than exile, Asterius. You deserve the chance to discover what life might offer beyond these walls." Together, they began the journey back toward the central chamber, following the silver thread that glowed ever brighter as they approached their destination. Behind them, the alcove that had been Asterius's prison for so many years stood empty for the first time since the labyrinth's completion. Ahead of them waited the unknown, the reaction of 13 young Athenians to the creature they had expected to fight, and beyond that, the even greater unknown of how two kingdoms might respond to the transformation of their ancient conflict. As they walked, Asterius spoke quietly of the years of his imprisonment, of the loneliness that had been his constant companion, of the gradual erosion of hope that had made him into something closer to the monster others believed him to be. But he also spoke of dreams that had sustained him, memories of his sister's laughter, of his father's pride when he had mastered a difficult lesson, of the simple joy he had once found in the beauty of a perfectly crafted verse or a brilliantly painted fresco. "Those dreams kept me human," he said as they neared the chamber where the others waited. "When everything else seemed lost, when the rage and loneliness threatened to consume what remained of who I had been, I would remember what it felt like to love and be loved in return. Perhaps that is what made it possible for me to recognize the kindness in your approach, to trust in your offer of friendship." The singing ahead of them had evolved into something more complex, not just voices raised in hope, but a kind of musical conversation, as if the singers were responding to sounds and rhythms they could hear echoing through the labyrinth. As Theseus and Asterius rounded the final corner and came within sight of the central chamber, they could see the 13 Athenian tributes arranged around the fountain in a circle, their hands joined, their faces lifted toward the light that filtered down from above. "They are beautiful," Asterius whispered, and Theseus heard in his voice an echo of the young prince who had once delighted in all forms of beauty and art. "They glow with life and hope and the love they bear for one another. How can I possibly approach such radiance without dimming it with my own darkness?" "You cannot dim their light," Theseus assured him. "Light is not diminished by encountering darkness, it transforms it. Watch, and you will see." Hand in hand, for Theseus had taken the creature's massive hand in his own. As they walked, they stepped into the central chamber. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The singing stopped as 13 pairs of eyes turned toward them, widening in shock and, yes, initial fear at the sight of the creature they had been sent to face. But something remarkable happened in the seconds that followed. Instead of screaming or fleeing, the young Athenians seemed to truly see what stood before them. They saw not a raging beast, but a being that walked upright, that held their prince's hand gently, that radiated not violence but a deep and abiding sadness. They saw tears glistening in dark eyes that reflected intelligence and pain in equal measure. They saw, in short, not a monster, but a person, different in form, but unmistakably possessed of a soul. It was Menestheus the poet who broke the silence, his voice soft with wonder rather than fear. "You are not what we expected," he said simply. "You are not what the stories told us to expect." Asterius found his voice with difficulty, the words coming slowly after so many years of having no one to speak with. I was, Prince Asterius of Crete. The gods transformed my body, but they could not transform my heart. I have been alone so long that I had forgotten what it meant to hope for friendship. Your companion, Prince Theseus, has reminded me. One by one, the young Athenians rose from their circle around the fountain and approached, not with fear, but with curiosity and growing understanding. Phaedra the weaver was the first to reach them, her artist's eye immediately seeing past the surface to the person beneath. "Your Highness," she said formally, offering a curtsy as she would to any prince, "we are honored to meet you." And with those simple words, everything changed. The ancient story of monster and sacrifice, of tribute and terror, dissolved like mist before the rising Sunday. In its place stood something new, a tale of understanding, of bridges built between worlds, of the transformative power of choosing compassion over fear. The silver thread that had guided them to this moment continued to glow with gentle radiance, no longer just a path through the labyrinth, but a symbol of the connections that could be forged between even the most unlikely friends. As the 14 young Athenians, and the transformed Prince of Crete gathered around the fountain at the heart of the maze. They were no longer separate peoples bound by ancient conflict, but simply human beings discovering the joy of understanding and acceptance. "Come," Theseus said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "Let us follow the thread back to the world above. We have work to do, kingdoms to heal, stories to rewrite, and a future to build together." As they began their journey back through the labyrinth, following the silver thread toward light and freedom, their voices rose once again in song. But now there were 15 voices instead of 14, and the harmony they created was richer and more beautiful than any they had achieved before. Behind them, the heart of the maze stood empty of its ancient sorrow, while ahead of them waited the infinite possibility of a world where understanding could triumph over fear, where love could transform even the darkest legends into stories of hope. The labyrinth that had been a prison was becoming a path to liberation, and the monster that had been a symbol of terror was becoming a bridge between worlds. As the silver thread led them ever upward toward the entrance where daylight waited to welcome them home, they carried with them the most precious treasure of all the knowledge that even the most impossible situations could be transformed by the simple act of choosing to see others not as enemies, but as friends waiting to be discovered. The thread of courage that had brought them to this place had become something even more powerful, a thread of connection that would bind their peoples together in understanding and peace for generations yet to come. And at the end of that thread, shining like a star to guide them safely home, lay the promise of white sails on the horizon, carrying news of victory won not through violence, but through the far greater triumph of love over fear. The sun was setting over the harbor of Knossos when the most extraordinary procession in the history of Crete emerged from the entrance to the labyrinth. Word had spread throughout the palace and the surrounding city that something unprecedented was happening, that sounds of singing rather than screaming had been echoing from the maze's depths, that lights had been seen dancing through passages that had known only darkness for years. The courtyard that had witnessed the solemn ritual of tribute only that morning was now filled with curious onlookers, all straining to catch the first glimpse of what might emerge from the legendary maze. King Minos sat upon his portable throne, his face a mask of regal composure that barely concealed the turmoil beneath. He had expected either silence indicating the tribute's swift death, or the sound of the Minotaur's rage as it dealt with intruders. Instead, he had heard music, laughter, and something that sounded remarkably like conversation echoing from the depths of his palace. Beside him, Princess Ariadne gripped the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles had gone white, her heart torn between hope and terror as she waited to learn the fate of the young prince who had captured not just her admiration but her love. The first figure to emerge from the labyrinth entrance was Theseus himself, the silver thread gleaming in his hands like captured starlight. His clothes were dusty from the maze's passages, but he walked with the confident stride of a man who had achieved something wonderful rather than merely survived something terrible. Behind him came his 13 companions, all present and accounted for, their faces glowing not with the pallor of fear, but with the radiance of those who had witnessed miracles. But it was the 15th figure emerging from the shadows that caused the assembled crowd to gasp in amazement and wonder. Prince Asterius, for he was immediately recognizable despite his transformation to those who remembered the young man. He had been walked beside the Athenian tributes, not as their captor, but as their friend. His massive form moved with dignity rather than menace, and his eyes, when they lifted to meet his father's gaze across the courtyard, held not rage, but a love so profound it seemed to illuminate the gathering dusk. The silence that fell over the courtyard was complete and profound, broken only by the sound of the fountain and the distant lapping of waves against the harbor walls. King Minos rose slowly from his throne, his face cycling through expressions of shock, disbelief, and finally, recognition. "Asterius?" he whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the stillness. "My son?" "Father," the transformed prince replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I have been lost in darkness for so long, but these friends from Athens have helped me remember who I am beneath what I became. I am still your son, still worthy of your love. If you can find it in your heart to look past this form to the soul within." What followed was a scene that those present would remember and speak of for the rest of their lives. The great King Minos, ruler of the mightiest kingdom in the ancient world, stepped down from his throne and walked across the courtyard with tears streaming down his cheeks. When he reached his transformed son, he looked up into those dark, intelligent eyes and saw not the monster of legend, but the beloved child he had mourned for so many years. "My boy," he said simply, and embraced Asterius with all the love and sorrow and joy of a father who had found his lost son. Princess Ariadne was not far behind, her own composure finally breaking as she ran to join the reunion. "Brother," she sobbed, her arms going around as much of Asterius as she could reach. "I have missed you so terribly, dreamed of you so often, prayed to every god that listens that someday you might be free of your prison." But even as the royal family was reunited in joy and wonder, Ariadne's eyes sought and found those of Theseus, who stood quietly to one side with his companions, giving the family their moment while the silver thread continued to gleam in his hands. Their gazes met across the courtyard, and in that look was a conversation more profound than words, gratitude and love, promise and possibility, the recognition that they had together accomplished something that would change both their worlds forever. As the initial shock and joy of the reunion began to settle, practical questions arose. What would happen now? How would this transformation of the ancient story affect the relationship between Crete and Athens? What place could Prince Asterius find in a world that had believed him to be a monster for so many years? 2-0. It was Theseus who provided the first answers, stepping forward with the natural authority of one who had proven himself through deed rather than birth. "Your Majesty," he addressed King Minos formally, "I propose that this day marks not just the end of an ancient tragedy, but the beginning of a new chapter in the relationship between our peoples. The tribute system that has bound us in sorrow can be replaced by bonds of trade, friendship, and mutual respect. Your son has shown that even the greatest curses can be transformed through understanding and compassion. Let our kingdoms learn that same lesson." King Minos, still overwhelmed by emotion but regaining his composure as a ruler, nodded slowly. "Prince Theseus, what you have accomplished here goes far beyond the courage of facing a monster. You have shown the wisdom to look past fear to find truth, the compassion to offer friendship where others would offer only violence. Yes, let this day begin a new era between our peoples. The tribute is ended, the ancient debt is paid, not in blood, but in understanding." But there remained the question of what would become of Prince Asterius himself. He could not simply resume his old life as if nothing had changed. Yet neither could he return to the isolation of the labyrinth. It was Asterius himself who provided the solution, speaking with the wisdom that comes from years of enforced contemplation. "I have lived too long in the darkness to simply step back into the light as if nothing had happened," he said thoughtfully. "But perhaps there is a middle path, a way to use what I have learned in isolation to help others who struggle with their own darkness." "What do you mean, brother?" Ariadne asked gently. Asterius smiled, an expression that transformed his fearsome features into something approaching beauty. The labyrinth need not remain empty, nor need it remain a place of death. It could become something new, a place of pilgrimage, perhaps, where those who are lost in their own mazes of fear and despair might come to find their way. I could be their guide, helping them navigate not just the passages of stone, but the darker passages of the human heart. The idea was revolutionary, transforming the labyrinth from a prison into a place of healing, from a symbol of death into a symbol of transformation and hope. Daedalus, emerging from his own chambers where he had been watching the proceedings with wonder and growing excitement, stepped forward to add his support. "Your Highness speaks wisdom," the old architect said. "The labyrinth was always meant to be more than a simple trap. In the right hands, with the right purpose, it could become a tool for helping people find their way through the complexities of life itself." As the evening deepened and torches were lit throughout the courtyard, plans began to take shape. The tribute ship that had brought the Athenians to Crete would return not with empty holds, but carrying news of a miracle, of ancient enemies become friends, of a monster become a guide for those seeking their own paths through life's labyrinths. But first, there would be a celebration, a feast to mark not just the survival of the tributes, but the transformation of the entire relationship between two great peoples. The banquet that followed was unlike any in the history of either kingdom. Athenians and Cretans sat side by side, sharing food and stories, music and laughter. Menestheus the poet composed verses celebrating not victory in battle, but victory of understanding over prejudice. Phaedra the weaver described tapestries she planned to create, depicting not the traditional scenes of heroes slaying monsters, but the far more beautiful image of a prince offering his hand in friendship to one who had been outcast and alone. And through it all, the silver thread that had made it possible gleamed softly in the lamplight, coiled now in a place of honor at the head table. Daedalus had explained its properties to the assembled guests, how it had been spun from starlight and destiny, how it had guided not just through the physical maze, but through the more complex labyrinth of fear and mistrust that had separated two peoples. It is a reminder, the old inventor said, that no maze is truly inescapable, no darkness truly absolute, as long as we have the courage to seek connection with others. As the celebration continued into the night, Theseus and Ariadne found themselves walking together in one of the palace gardens, away from the crowds and the noise, beneath stars that seemed to shine more brightly than usual. The princess had changed from her formal court robes into a simple white dress that made her look like a goddess of the moon, while Theseus had shed his dusty travel clothes for a tunic the color of the sea at dawn. "You kept your promise," Ariadne said softly as they paused beside a fountain surrounded by night-blooming jasmine. "You faced the Minotaur, faced my brother, and found not destruction but redemption. You saw past the surface to the truth beneath. How did you know it was possible?" Theseus turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the starlight like pools of captured heaven. "I knew because someone believed it was possible, someone who gave me a thread spun from hope and love to guide me through the darkness. Your faith in the possibility of redemption made my courage possible. We did this together, you and I, just as we must face whatever comes next together." "And what comes next?" she asked, though her eyes already held the answer she hoped to hear. Theseus took her hands in his, marveling at how perfectly they fit together, how right it felt to stand with her beneath the ancient stars of Crete while planning a future that would unite two worlds. "Next we sail for Athens," he said gently, "not as conqueror and captive, not as enemy and enemy, but as partners in building something new. Your father has agreed to let you come with me, to be my bride and my partner in ruling Athens with wisdom and compassion. But more than that, you will help me establish schools where Athenian and Cretan children learn together, workshops where our artisans share their skills, temples where our peoples worship side by side in peace." The vision he painted was beautiful beyond words. a future where the silver thread that had guided them through the labyrinth would become the first strand in a tapestry of connection, binding two peoples in friendship and mutual respect. Ariadne could see it all, the ships sailing between Athens and Crete, carrying not soldiers but scholars, not weapons but works of art, not threats but gifts of friendship. "Yes," she said simply, the word carrying all the weight of a vow and all the lightness of a song. "Yes, I will come with you, marry you, help you build this dream of peace. But first, let us keep another promise. You swore to your father that if you survived, if you triumphed, you would return with white sails to herald your victory. Tomorrow, when we sail for Athens, let those white sails carry news not just of one man's survival, but of two people's transformation." The next morning dawned clear and bright, with a fresh breeze from the north that would carry their ship swiftly toward Athens. The tribute vessel had been transformed overnight from a ship of sorrow into a ship of celebration. The black sails that had marked its grim purpose were struck and replaced with sails of pristine white that caught the morning sun like clouds painted with gold. From the harbor walls, crowds of Cretans waved farewell, not to departing victims, but to beloved friends. Prince Asterius stood at the harbor's edge, his great form silhouetted against the brightening sky, watching as his sister prepared to begin a new life in a distant land. But there was no sadness in his farewell, only joy and pride. "Tell the world," he called out as the ship began to move, "that monsters can become men again, that mazes can become paths to freedom, that even the darkest stories can find their way to light." King Minos, standing beside his transformed son, raised his hand in royal blessing. "Go with our love," he shouted across the widening water, "and know that Crete will always be a second home to you. You carry with you not just our princess, but our hopes for a future brighter than any we dared to imagine." As the ship sailed out of the harbor and into the open sea, Theseus stood at the bow with Ariadne beside him, the silver thread coiled carefully in his hands, not as a tool that had served its purpose and could be discarded, but as a precious reminder of what courage and love could accomplish when working together. Behind them, the 14 other young Athenians shared stories of their adventure with the Cretan sailors, already building the friendships that would be the foundation of the new alliance between their peoples. The voyage to Athens passed like a dream, painted in shades of blue and gold. The white sails billowed proudly in the favorable winds, carrying them swiftly across waters that had once seemed to separate enemies, but now served to unite friends. Dolphins raced alongside their vessel as if celebrating their triumph, and seabirds called out greetings from the crystalline sky. Even the sea itself seemed to understand that this was no ordinary journey, for the waves carried them gently homeward with the tenderness of a mother rocking her child to sleep. On the afternoon of the third day, the familiar coastline of Attica appeared on the horizon, and with it the sight that made Theseus's heart swell with joy and triumph. From the lighthouse tower that guarded Athens' harbor, a lone figure could be seen watching the approaching ship. King Aegeus had kept his vigil every day since his son's departure, scanning the horizon for black sails that would confirm his worst fears, or white sails that would herald the miracle he barely dared to hope for. As the ship drew closer and the white sails became unmistakably clear against the azure sky, the figure on the lighthouse began to wave with increasing excitement. Soon the king's joy could be contained no longer, and he began ringing the great bronze bell that would alert all Athens to the news. The sound rang out across the city like the voice of celebration itself, and within moments, people began streaming toward the harbor from every district and quarter. The scene that greeted Theseus and his companions as they entered the harbor was unlike anything in the city's history. The waterfront was packed with citizens, nobles and commoners, merchants and artisans, children and elders, all cheering and weeping with joy as the ship with white sails glided toward the dock. Flowers rained down from windows and balconies, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the music of celebration. King Aegeus was among the first to board the ship, and the reunion between father and son was witnessed by thousands who would speak of it for generations. "My boy," the king said, his voice breaking with emotion as he embraced Theseus, "you have returned not just alive but triumphant. The white sails tell me you succeeded beyond my wildest hopes, but I need to hear it from your own lips. What miracle have you accomplished in the labyrinth of Crete?" "Father," Theseus replied, his arm around the king's shoulders, "I have learned that the greatest victories are won not with sword or spear, but with understanding and compassion. The Minotaur lives still, but he is no longer a monster. He is Prince Asterius, son of Minos, and he has chosen to transform his prison into a place of healing for others who lose their way in life's complexities. The tribute is ended not through conquest, but through friendship, and I have brought with me not spoils of war, but the most precious gift imaginable." He turned then to present Ariadne, who had been standing quietly beside him, taking in her first sight of the city that would become her new home. "Father, may I present Princess Ariadne of Crete, daughter of King Minos, whose wisdom and courage made all of this possible. She has consented to become my wife and your daughter, and with her comes not just my happiness, but the promise of lasting peace between our peoples." King Aegeus looked upon the young woman who had captured his son's heart and saw immediately why Theseus had chosen her. There was wisdom in her dark eyes, strength in her bearing, and a kindness that seemed to illuminate everything around her. "Princess Ariadne," he said formally, taking her hands in his own, "welcome to Athens. Your reputation for wisdom and compassion has reached even here, and we are honored beyond measure that you choose to make our city your home." "Your Majesty," Ariadne replied with a grace that immediately won the hearts of all who heard her. I come not as a stranger, but as one who has already learned to love Athens through the courage and kindness of its prince. I bring with me not just my own devotion, but the friendship of all Crete and the promise that our children will grow up in a world where Athenians and Cretans work together for the good of all. The celebration that followed lasted for 3 days and 3 nights, with feasts in every district of the city and performances by the greatest artists and musicians from across the Greek world. But more than just a celebration of Theseus's triumph, it became a festival of hope for the future, a recognition that the ancient cycles of fear and revenge could indeed be broken by those brave enough to choose a different path. In the royal palace, in the quiet moments between the public celebrations, Theseus and Ariadne worked with King Aegeus and his counselors to lay the groundwork for the new relationship between Athens and Crete. Trade agreements were drafted that would bring prosperity to both kingdoms. Cultural exchanges were planned that would enrich both peoples, and most importantly, a new tradition was established to replace the old tribute system. Every 7 years, instead of ships carrying frightened young people to their deaths, vessels would sail between Athens and Crete, carrying students and teachers, artists and craftsmen, all dedicated to learning from each other and strengthening the bonds between their peoples. The Labyrinth itself would become a destination for pilgrims seeking wisdom and guidance, with Prince Asterius serving as a gentle guide for those who needed help finding their way through life's complexities. 2.0. The silver thread that had made it all possible was given a place of honor in the Temple of Athena, where it continued to glow with soft radiance as a reminder that no obstacle was truly insurmountable for those who approached it with wisdom, courage, and love. Pilgrims would come from across the Mediterranean to see the legendary thread and to hear the story of how a prince and princess from enemy kingdoms had chosen understanding over conflict, healing over harm. On the evening of the 3rd day of celebration, as the last of the festival fires burned low and the city settled into peaceful sleep, Theseus and Ariadne walked together through the palace gardens where he had spent so many childhood hours dreaming of adventure. The same olive trees rustled in the night breeze. The same fountains played their gentle music, but everything was transformed by the presence of the woman who would soon be his wife and partner in building a better world. "Do you ever regret it?" Theseus asked softly as they paused beside the fountain where he had made his first vows to help his people. "Leaving everything you knew, giving up your life in Crete to come to a foreign land?" Ariadne smiled, her face luminous in the starlight that seemed to echo the glow of the silver thread they had followed through the labyrinth. "How could I regret choosing love over loneliness, hope over fear, the chance to build something beautiful with someone who sees the world as I do? Besides, she added with a laugh that was like music made visible. "I have not left my home behind. I have simply discovered that home is not a place but the people we choose to love and who choose to love us in return." They were married the following spring in a ceremony that brought together not just two people but two peoples in celebration of their union. King Minos himself sailed to Athens for the wedding, accompanied by Prince Asterius, whose presence at the celebration caused wonder and joy rather than fear. The transformed prince had indeed become what Theseus had envisioned, a bridge between worlds, a living symbol that redemption was possible even in the most hopeless circumstances. The children who were born to Theseus and Ariadne grew up in a world far different from the one their parents had inherited. They learned the languages of both Athens and Crete, studied the arts and sciences of both cultures, and understood from their earliest years that strength came not from conquering others, but from connecting with them. They played in gardens where flowers from both kingdoms bloomed side by side, and they heard bedtime stories, not of monsters and heroes locked in eternal conflict, but of the silver thread that had guided their parents to each other and to the understanding that love was stronger than any labyrinth. And in the years that followed, as trade flourished between the kingdoms and cultural exchange enriched both peoples, sailors crossing the waters between Athens and Crete would often report seeing dolphins following in the wake of their ships, as if the very sea creatures understood that these waters now carried messages of friendship rather than threats of war. The wine of Crete graced Athenian tables, while Athenian olive oil lit Cretan lamps, and children from both kingdoms grew up learning that differences were not obstacles to be overcome, but gifts to be shared. The labyrinth continued to serve its new purpose, welcoming pilgrims who came seeking guidance through the mazes of their own lives. Prince Asterius, patient and wise in his transformed state, would meet with visitors in the very chamber where he had once waited in loneliness and despair. But now that chamber was filled with light and warmth, decorated with gifts of gratitude from those whose lives had been changed by his gentle counsel. He would share with them the lesson he had learned from a young prince who had chosen to see past his fearsome appearance to the soul within. That transformation was always possible, that even the darkest stories could find their way to light. And sometimes, late at night when the moon was full and the sea was calm, those keeping watch on the harbor walls of both Athens and Crete would swear they could see threads of silver light stretching across the water, not just connecting the two cities, but weaving a web of understanding that would hold their peoples together for generations to come. The thread that had begun as a tool for navigating a single labyrinth had become the foundation of a tapestry of peace that would endure long after those who wove it had passed into legend. Thus ends the tale of Theseus and the labyrinth, not with the death of a monster, but with the birth of understanding, not with the triumph of one kingdom over another, but with the discovery that enemies could become friends, that mazes could become pathways, and that even the most tangled threads of fate could be rewoven into patterns of hope and beauty. For in the end, the greatest adventures are not those that end in conquest, but those that end in connection, the joining of hearts across the divisions that once seemed insurmountable, guided always by the silver thread of courage that leads us safely home. Sleep well, dear listener, and dream of threads of starlight that can guide you through any labyrinth, of friendships that can transform enemies into beloved companions, and of the courage that lives within each of us, waiting only for the right moment to shine forth and light the way to a more beautiful world. For every heart carries its own silver thread, and every maze, no matter how complex, has a path that leads to love.